You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi friends, it's Annie in Boston.
And I'm Johanna from Austria. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Fresh Hell, your favorite international podcast. And thank you so much for your support. And as always, a special shout out to our newest Patreon member, who is Lisa Hauser. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much, Lisa. If you want to know more about our Patreon episodes, just keep listening, and at the end of this episode, we will tell you all about it.
We are very excited about today's episode, which is the first in a two-part series about the 6 wives of Henry VIII.
Oh, so exciting.
It's going to be so much fun today to hear me say that all the time with my lovely Austrian accent.
I love it. I love it. Some people may remember the order of the wives by the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Today, we are going to discuss the first 3, Katherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour. And I think the primary trigger warning for these episodes is going to be that there will be a lot of talk about pregnancy, miscarriage, stillbirth, infertility, infidelity, infant mortality. Yeah, we're going to be discussing this a lot because of the subject and the dangers of Tudor childbirth. So that is one thing to be aware of, although we're not going to be going into great deal on, the infant passing. It also happened a long time ago. Is this our earliest one?
I think so. I'm not entirely sure, but I think so. And also please keep in mind that, back then a woman's sole purpose was pretty much producing children and taking care of the family, and 1 in 3 women died during childbearing years with an average life expectancy of around 35, and also the medical conditions at that time were horrific, so that is something to remember if this is a sensitive topic for you. And even then, there were of course women who safely delivered many children and lived long and very happy lives.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Just not so much for these particular women. So we'll begin at the beginning with Katherine of Aragon. I think we would agree that she is often looked at as this, poor, sad, I feel like I'm channeling Alexis from Schitt's Creek, but, she's this poor, sad, neglected, hyper-religious original wife who was, dropped for the younger woman, right? But she was a fascinating person, and her story it's complicated, and it's fascinating. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we hope you'll think so, too.
I hope so. We have a lot of sources for these 2 episodes, including The 6 Wives of Henry VIII by Allison Weir. David Starkey has a book as well of the same title. And there's also a great 3-part PBS show with historian Lucy Worsley, which has a great website as well that we've linked to. The book Mistress Anne by Carolee Erickson, and a couple of podcasts if you want to take a deep dive. I would recommend the Queens of England podcast by James Bolton, the Historic Royal Palaces podcast, and Anthony Rich's Stories of the Tudors podcasts, because most podcasts would do 4 or 5 hours per queen. We are not doing that. So we will have lots of sources for you to check out. Hopefully will kind of pique your curiosity. And today we're going to do the first 3 wives. So we'll start with Katherine of Aragon, the divorced.
Catalina was the youngest child of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. So yes, that's Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish monarchs who founded Columbus. They did quite a few good things too, like uniting Spain, but they also started the Spanish Inquisition, which was decidedly not good.
No, and nobody expected it.
In 1485, a pregnant Queen Isabella, aka the Warrior Queen, had been riding out with her troops but had finally headed to Alcalá de Henares, which is near Madrid, to take a little time off campaigns to have her baby. And so that's where Princess Catalina was born on 16th of December 1485. And she was lovely. She had pale skin, blue eyes, hair that was somewhere between strawberry blonde and auburn. I think, like with many of us, it darkened with age.
Yeah.
I'm the opposite. I was born with raven black hair.
Oh.
And it got so much lighter. But yeah, most importantly, she was very intelligent. She was a devout Catholic and born and raised to be queen. So when she was 3 years old, she was betrothed to Henry VII's eldest son and heir to the English throne, Prince Arthur, who was a year younger than her and who was also a baby. The marriage contract was known as the Treaty of Medina del Campo and was signed in 1489. This was the last match in a series of marriages set up by Ferdinand and Isabella for the children to help unify their lands with the Habsburgers, of course, and Portugal, as well as other ruling families, including the Tudors of England. Even though there were newcomers on the royal dynasty scene, comparatively speaking, the Tudors had only just taken the throne from the Plantagenets, and so Henry VII's grip on the crown was not quite as firm as he'd like yet. And in fact, Isabella had enough royal English blood that, technically speaking, Catherine had a more legitimate claim to the throne than her fiancé, or even her future father-in-law, the current king. But there had never been a ruling queen in England. Her job would be to provide England an heir to the throne. Catalina grew up learning Latin, which is particularly impressive because Queen Isabella was determined all of her children receive a better education than she had, and Latin in particular was, at the time, only taught to boys. And it was helpful because Latin is how Catalina and Arthur communicated, through letters written in Latin, because Arthur didn't speak Spanish and Catalina didn't speak English.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that she wasn't taught English as a child once she was betrothed to the future King of England. But I guess at that time, only a very small percentage of the world really spoke. English wouldn't have been an important language to really know. I know she was encouraged to speak French, but still, it just surprises me a little.
She studied the Bible, philosophy, history and law while watching her parents fight, win and celebrate victories over non-Catholics, and she traveled with them on their campaigns to push the Moors out of the country, making Spain a Catholic nation. She watched her parents rule together, her mother Isabella a queen in her own right. She learned to sew, embroider, to dance, play cards and chess, to hunt and manage a household, and to do all the things that royal women, that queens, were expected to do. And she seems to have had a close and loving family. Although her parents were often traveling around the country on campaigns, they took their children with them, rather than leaving them with a governess. And Ferdinand and Isabella do seem more involved in the children's lives than most monarchs would have been at that time, or really for a long time to come. Just remember the Habsburg episodes we did there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when she was 14, she was married by proxy to Arthur Tudor, as promised in treaty. Which must have been so odd for both the 13-year-old future king and the man standing next to him, pledging their vows. But at the time, a marriage was not considered a true marriage until it was consummated, so this was just a formality. The marriage contract treaty was a complicated legal document that took years to be agreed upon by both royal families. Spain definitely got the better bargain, but they also sent their youngest with a dowry of 200,000 crowns to be paid in installments, and England needed that money. They also shared a common dislike for France.
Yeah, England, Spain, and France at this time, it's like they're like a group of preteen friends. Like 1 week they're all best friends, but then the next week 2 of them have ganged up on one of the others, and then the next week they all fucking hate each other, and then oh my god, it's fine, you're all best friends again. Like England, France, and Spain are like a preteen group of friends, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good description for that situation.
It changes so fast. It's like it's like, well, this week England and France hate Spain, but next week Spain and France are going to really hate England. It's so bizarre. Yeah.
So when Catalina was 15, as promised, it was time to set sail from Spain, headed to England. But first she'd need a trousseau. Annie, would you like to read this quote by Allison Weir?
Yeah, you bet. So she writes, quote, "There was also a trousseau to be assembled. Catherine was to take with her many fine gowns of velvet and cloth of gold and silver, cut in the Spanish fashion, as well as undergarments edged with fine black work lace, and hoods of velvet braided with gold, silver, or pearls. The latter she would need after her marriage, when convention required a wife to cover her hair. Only on state occasions would she wear it loose. Then there were night robes edged with lace for summer and fur for winter, cloth stockings, wooden stays, as well as the stiff Spanish farthingales that belled out the skirts of her gowns. Also in the trousseau was the gold and silver plate, which was part of Catherine's dowry, and her jewelry, some of which was very fine, and included heavy collar chains and crucifixes and large brooches to be pinned to the center of Catherine's bodices beneath the square necklines that would stay fashionable and plunge ever lower for the next 60 years. Lastly, lastly, a reminder to the princess of where her duty lay. The queen packed a beautifully embroidered christening robe. End quote.
No pressure at all.
Right? Oh, God.
But yeah, joking aside, it must have been so difficult knowing she would probably never see her family again. If that wasn't a hard enough thing for a 15-year-old girl, they ran into storms, and one was so bad they had to turn back and repair the ships, creating a month-long delay. Catalina thought she would die, but finally, on 2nd of October 1501, they reached the shores of England, where she would be called Catherine. When she and her entourage arrived, they were greeted with cheers by the locals and a feast. But she doesn't meet her fiancé yet, as they ended up docking in the closest port for them, rather than the one closest to Arthur. But it's not a long wait, and she finally meets her beloved Arthur, and it turns out that while they both were fluent in Latin, their pronunciation of the language was so different that they couldn't understand each other. But somehow they sorted it out, they made it work, and they were very much in love. On 14th of November 1501, Arthur and Catherine were married in St. Paul's Cathedral. Yes, the original one, lost in the Great Fire of London. The current St. Paul's Cathedral was built on the same site, by the way. And while it's true that Victoria first made the white wedding dress popular, she wasn't the first to wear the color. In fact, both Arthur and Catherine wore white satin. Catherine was escorted down the aisle by Arthur's younger brother, Henry, who was 10 years old, 6 years younger than Catherine. The wedding mass lasted 3 hours, and that night, after the feasting and revelry, they had the traditional bedding ceremony. A whole group of them, including 50 or 60 noblemen and women, would all head to the bedchamber. Their attendants would undress them, then once sitting side by side under the covers, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London would bless the bed and the couple in it, praying for a fruitful union.
Yeah, and then they'd leave and they'd all listen outside the door. So it's like first the christening gown packed in your luggage, and then you've got bishops in your bedroom on your wedding night. And she's like 16. She might have been, the ages of everyone in this story are a bit, except for the king, but yeah, 16, and he's 15. And although this is very much the norm back then, Lady Margaret Beaufort was King Henry VII's mother, and she had him as a 13-year-old widow. So it's not unusual, but it is still for our minds to kind of be like, oh, there's children in a bed. Okay.
So the wedding night of Arthur and Catherine would turn out to be one of the most speculated wedding nights in history. Did they consummate or not? Arthur had joked about feeling lusty, and the day after he joked he'd, quote, been in Spain, end quote. But there was no public display of stained sheets, so we don't really know, but more on that later. There was a week of banquets, jousting and pageants and all manner of celebrations. The first payment of Catherine's dowry was paid, and then the young couple were headed to the Welsh Marches and Ludlow Castle.
I've been to Ludlow a few times. It's a really lovely little medieval market town. It's not far from my family in Worcestershire. I definitely recommend a day trip when things are safe again. It's got really great architecture and shops and restaurants.
I want to go now. I've never been.
There's a lot of places here, and like as we're taking notes, I'm like, all right, I've been to this one. I still haven't been to this castle. I still need to go to this one. Just with the Tudor stuff, I have a list.
So sadly, it's here at Ludlow in the spring of 1502 that they both became ill with what was known as the sweating sickness. So there's been a lot of debate in modern time over what the disease, aka the English sweat, was exactly.
In the 1990s, there was an outbreak of hantavirus in a Navajo population in the United States, and it had a 50% mortality rate, which is horrifying. And some people believe that it was likely another form of a hantavirus as opposed to an influenza, which is another theory. But we knew that sometimes people could be dead within 24 hours of showing outbreaks, and it seemed to affect the rich more than the poor, and there was lots of outbreaks of it.
Yeah, so both Arthur and Catherine became ill. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. Now, Catherine was a 16-year-old widow, and suddenly Prince Henry's future was changed dramatically. He would be terrified his whole life of the sweating sickness, and his fascination with medicine would lead to him creating the Royal College of Physicians in 1518. But that was ways off still. So it's 2nd of April 1502, Arthur has died. Catherine is still too sick to attend his funeral, although even if she'd been fine, I think royal protocols would not have allowed her to attend. And Arthur was laid to rest in Worcester Cathedral.
Yeah, his tomb is beautiful. I'll post some photos.
And Ferdinand, not wanting to lose the alliance to England, proposed to Henry VII that she marry young Henry after Isabella empathetically shot down Henry VII's suggestion he might marry her. And so in September of 1502 a new treaty was drafted for the marriage of Katherine of Aragon to Prince Henry. This marriage was arranged when Catherine disclosed that although she had been married to Arthur, they had not yet consummated their marriage and she was still a virgin, and they got special dispensation from the Pope for permission. There would be more versions of this new marriage treaty. Her mother, Isabella, died in 1504, just 2 years after she was widowed, and less than a year later, Prince Henry, at his father's command, publicly renounced their engagement. Catherine was worth less with her mother no longer living, and with Isabella gone, for the next 7 years, Catherine was basically at the mercy of her father-in-law, Henry VII, and her own father, Ferdinand, who both treated her like an object and rarely as a human. She had no money, and each king claimed it was the other's responsibility to care for her. And she was forced to change addresses often at the whim of the king. King Henry thought he might be able to make a better match for his son Prince Henry, but he also wanted the dowry. And so things were not settled for 7 years, while contracts were written and rewritten and dispensations from the Pope asked for. During this time, 2 important things happened. Catherine served as ambassador to Spain in 1507, the first female ambassador in European history. And the second thing, young Henry did fall in love with Catherine, and she was moved out of close proximity to him in hopes he'd get over her. She really suffered a lot, having to write and beg her father or Henry for funds to pay her staff, her ladies-in-waiting. That was a normal part of the Queen's staff. Ladies-in-waiting came from good families and were usually expected to be physically attractive. They would keep the Queen company sometimes, as was the case with Maria de Salinas, becoming the closest of friends. But it was Catherine's job in return for their service to help make matches for these girls with young men at court, and if necessary, assist with dowries. Now her once rich, sumptuous clothing was almost in rags, and she was forced to sell some of the plate she had brought with her as part of her dowry to pay her debts. We can only imagine what an incredibly dark and lonely situation she was in, and this went on for years, until Henry VII died, leaving young Henry VIII king. Once his father had died, Henry could have whomever he wanted, and he would have a love match. With his father gone, he could marry Catherine. He would have seen himself as her savior as well. This was still a time of chivalry and courtly love. On 11th of June 1509, less than 2 months after his father died, 18-year-old Henry and 23-year-old Catherine were married in a private ceremony, and this marriage was consummated on their wedding night. The wedding may have been small. The new king was of course still in mourning for his recently deceased father, and it wouldn't be appropriate, but their coronation would be lavish. Less than 2 weeks after the wedding, on Sunday 24th of June 1509, the young couple were crowned and anointed at Westminster Abbey. There were lavish celebrations and many nights of the bath created. The couple were in love, and about 2 months after their wedding, Catherine was pregnant. And they were elated. On 31st of January, she went into labor prematurely and gave birth to a stillborn daughter. Of course, she was devastated, but the royal physician, who didn't wash his hands often, was certain that the queen had suffered a loss, but that she had lost 1 child of a twin pregnancy. And of course, desperately wanting to believe this, everyone agrees that this is what happened and there's still a healthy baby to be delivered. Soon it was time for Catherine to go into confinement for the last month of her pregnancy. She would withdraw to her chamber with her ladies-in-waiting and maids of honor. A fire would be blazing in the hearth. Tapestries would be placed on every surface, the ceiling and floors, as well as the walls. There would only be 1 small window cracked for fresh air because they believed in miasma as the cause of disease at this time.
Yeah, I think the idea was to make the room like as warm and dark and womb-like as possible, which... it's not the worst idea.
Yeah.
But my God, can you imagine how hot and stuffy and just the smell? No.
I couldn't, no.
Too many people.
Now, sadly, Catherine was not pregnant with another living twin. More than likely, she had an infection causing her abdomen to swell. And when she was in confinement, expecting the other baby to be born, the rest may have helped her heal, and soon it was clear there was no second baby. Catherine wrote to her father begging not to be angry with her for giving birth to a stillborn daughter.
Yeah, and I think we just need to take a quick moment and let that fact sort of wash over you, because she just lost a baby, but had been told she still had another, only to find out she did not, which must have been another enormous loss, and her first reaction is to apologize to her husband and father for failing them by not delivering a healthy son. It's like... Of course, also back then, they didn't know that it's the sperm that determines the gender of the baby, which really does put everything we're talking about now into different light, doesn't it? Like,
yeah.
I don't know if you'd have cared if you'd known, but still.
It does.
Yeah.
It does definitely put everything for us.
Yeah.
In a different light, especially when you look at what ended up happening. But for now, back to Catherine. Henry was actually a loving and supportive husband. He was telling Catherine that they were still young and there would be plenty of children to come.
And she was looking forward to that because I think that most people, when they think Henry VIII, they think of a very heavy-set, bearded, balding, middle-aged man with a festering sore on his leg that wouldn't heal. But young Henry is very handsome. He's 6'2". He stands head and shoulders above most men at the time. He was very athletic and strangely and interestingly proud of his calves. He was always like, does the King of France have better calves than me? I bet not. He loved jousting and tennis and hunting. And Catherine wasn't shy about blood sports. She loved hunting with him. He was intelligent. He was known to be kind to his people. He spoke several languages, played several musical instruments, and he composed music that's still performed today. He wrote a book defending the Pope and the sacraments. And when he did that, he, as well as Catherine, were given the title Defender of the Faith. He was known to be witty and just make everyone feel at ease. So, yeah, Henry VIII was a young, hot, virile, young Renaissance man. And he'd have been appealing, I think, no matter what his status. I think that's something that people don't understand as much about him. And he did really seem to love Catherine, at least when he was young. Although love and fidelity didn't go hand in hand, because while queens were forced to be faithful under punishment of death, kings were, of course, free to pursue extramarital affairs, but that didn't necessarily mean it was easy for pregnant Catherine to handle.
No. But Henry was, as we said, loving when she lost her first child, and he was right, there would be more. 4 months after losing her first child, Catherine was pregnant again. On 1st of January 1511, she gave birth to a boy. Finally, her prayers were answered. She had accomplished what she was born and raised to do. She had given England an heir. They fired guns from the Tower of London, bells were rung, they lit the beacons to let the whole country know, and they passed out free wine to people celebrating in the streets. 5 days after his birth, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was christened at the Richmond Palace. Sadly, only 52 days after he was born, the infant prince died suddenly. Catherine and Henry were devastated. And there was an elaborate funeral with the baby's body transported on the Thames to Westminster, where he was interred. So, now it's 1513, Henry left to fight in France and left Catherine to rule while he was gone. He trusted his queen to rule, which is notable because Scotland took note and decided to make a move on England while Henry was distracted in France, and the country was being ruled by a woman. But this was no ordinary woman. Catherine was the daughter of the warrior queen, and she called on the noble families to send their troops, and she rode some 200 miles to Warwick with armor and weapons taken from the Tower. She coordinated supplies and organized the transportation of the new army she raised, and she sewed banners, and in part because of her, the Scottish army was decimated at Flodden. She was brought the bloodied coat of the now deceased King James IV of Scotland, which some sources claim annoyed her, as she would have preferred his body, or at least his head.
Yeah.
She sent the coat to Henry in France, and her popularity with the people of England grew. But 1513 wasn't all victories for Catherine. On 17th of September 1513, Catherine gave birth to a son. It's believed that she went into premature labor because Henry was still in France, and he certainly would have planned to be there for the birth, and she also had not yet entered confinement. The baby was alive when he was born, but did not live long. Catherine was devastated. She had prayed, gone to mass daily, she had fasted, she had gone to holy shrines often, made promises to God, and yet still didn't have a child. And in November of 1514, Catherine gave birth to her fourth child, another stillborn son, delivered at around 8 months. This was described as an event bringing great grief onto the whole court.
I just can't even imagine that kind of situation, because This unfortunately, miscarriage, stillbirths, these are all things that happen today. But today, you've got loved ones, family, friends, and, everybody's grieving with the mother and the father and the family, right? Whereas here, probably they largely would have seen Catherine as being responsible. And a lot of the nation would have blamed her for their grief and for the king's grief. And it's also around this time that Henry takes a mistress, one of Catherine's own maids of honor. They were the junior ladies in waiting, and her name was Elizabeth Blount.
It's almost certain that the king had plenty of other women, not just 3 main mistresses who we'll be discussing. In France, it was a royal position, maîtresse au théâtre, treated with respect. But also most royal marriages were arranged and not necessarily love matches, so the king keeping his queen pregnant as often as possible was more or less his duty. There would be no sex for the queen once she was pregnant because that was viewed as dangerous to the pregnancy. But they didn't yet understand the negative effects that stress can have on a pregnancy, and it was understood the king would look elsewhere. But the difference here was Henry and Catherine were a rare love match. She certainly was in love with him, and this was another cross for her to bear, although at least Henry was discreet. Fortunately, Catherine was soon pregnant again, and on 18th of February 1516, Catherine gave birth to her 5th child, a baby girl who survived.
She was christened Mary and would one day be Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, England's first queen, but that's still a long ways away yet. Catherine was absolutely besotted with her new infant daughter, as was the king, but she had still yet to fulfill her duty to provide both an heir and a spare Tudor sons to Henry. On November 9th, 1518, Catherine again went into labor a month early and gave birth to a stillborn daughter. This would be the 6th and final pregnancy for Catherine. She was 33, and at the time, the average life expectancy was around 35. She would have no more children, having had 6 pregnancies in 9 years and 1 living daughter. And this pain was in no doubt compounded when only 6 months, roughly, after she had lost her last child, her husband's mistress for the past several years, Elizabeth Blount, who was, as we said, one of her own ladies in waiting, gave birth to the king's bastard child.
That's right. After losing her last child, she then had to watch her own maid of honor growing larger in her own pregnancy, but she was taken out of sight to avoid scandal, and on 15th of June 1519, Bessie Blount gave birth to a son. The king would eventually claim him, acknowledge him as his son, and giving him the name Henry Fitzroy, son of the king. Henry had proven the world he could father healthy sons. Henry may have also had a daughter with Bessie. There was a daughter of hers he took more interest in than would be usual, but we don't know for sure. But sometime around 1520-ish, he loses interest in Bessie and tells Cardinal Wolsey, his chancellor and most trusted advisor, to find her a husband.
My first wedding was at a medieval manor house, and the real selling point for me was not the moat, but the tree in the garden that was known to be one of Cardinal Wolsey's favorite trees in England. But that is a story for another time. Maybe Patreon weddings episode. We definitely have a little bit of experience there between us. Just saying. All right, so let's talk about the next mistress to catch Henry's eye. This was the eldest Boleyn girl, Mary. Mary was the daughter of diplomat and courtier Thomas Boleyn, who was the first Earl of Wiltshire, by his marriage to Lady Elizabeth Howard, the eldest daughter of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk. She had 2 siblings, Anne and George, and they grew up at Hever Castle in Kent. Mary and her younger sister Anne were given the usual high-born lady education, which included the basic principles of arithmetic, grammar, history, reading, spelling, and writing, all normal subjects. But then we had genealogy. This was something Catherine would have been taught too. After genealogy, the things she learned would be both vastly different and maybe not so different from today. She was taught music, singing and dancing, embroidery, sewing, and other needlecraft, as well as etiquette and household management and games such as cards and chess. She was also taught archery, falconry, riding, and hunting. I think it's really the falconry, though, that says nobility.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure the falconry. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Like, you can be as fancy as you want, but dost thou even have a falcon? I thought not. All right. So now we don't know the actual birthdays of either Anne or Mary Boleyn, somewhere between 1500 and 1507, with Mary being the eldest. And I think most historians believe that Mary was born around 1500 and Anne was probably born around 1507. Because of her father's diplomatic work in Europe, Anne was offered a place in Margaret of Austria's household. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of evidence that she might have been somewhat younger than the usual age. In 1513, both Mary and Anne went to France as maids of honor to the king's sister, Mary Tudor. She was about to marry Louis XII of France, and once there, Anne would serve as a lady-in-waiting to Mary Tudor's stepdaughter, the 15-year-old Queen Claude. I believe they were of a similar age at that time. During her time at the French court, Anne's French became fluent, and she became a young woman with interests in literature and illuminated manuscripts and religious philosophy. She enjoyed art, fashion, poetry, dance, and she learned the many, many, many complicated rules of courtly love. Courtly love was a complicated game of flirtation with just so many rules. This is a massive, there are so many really big oversimplifications, I feel like, in this episode, but courtly love was sort of like taking flirtation as far as you could without actually doing anything unchaste or unseemly, even though, and especially because you were married to someone else. Remember, at this time, if your family were noble enough to be at court, the odds were you were married to someone your parents chose for you. You hope you have a mutual respect and hopefully friendship, and maybe you can, you just like each other. If you're really lucky, you might fall in love. But there would be a lot of lonely, highborn married people, I think, as well as a lot of young teenage girls married to men old enough to be their grandfathers. But we'll talk about that next episode at different times. So, in 1519, Mary Boleyn was called back to England. There are some historians who will say that Mary had already been the mistress of the French king. That's possible. He's quoted as making comments about her being his mare and other innuendos insinuating that she was his mistress. But we don't actually know for sure. We don't know the truth. And it's a debated fact. We do know that she was a maid of honor for Queen Catherine at Henry's court. And on February 4th, 1520, Mary Boleyn married William Carey. William was a very good friend of Henry VIII's, and in fact, the king attended their wedding. The two men were both athletic and enjoyed jousting and hunting and riding. And that's why it might surprise you to hear that Henry's next mistress was no other than his good friend's wife, the lovely Mary Carey. No way around that name, really, is there? Mary Carey.
Yeah, it's probably why she's referred as Mary Boleyn.
Yeah.
Dad and her sister, if only their parents had known both surviving daughters would end up with the king, maybe someone would have taken the time to write down their birthdays.
Were girls even worth the ink to write it down, though? I mean, girls.
I mean, yes, you're right, yeah. But I don't know, it's also often enough true for boys, I have the feeling. At least I know from quite a few Habsburg sons, the distant relatives of the emperor line, where exact date of birth is not known at all, or just the date of the baptism, for example.
I know. It's wild to think about, huh?
Yeah. And it's just a date.
It's just a date. Don't stop being so selfish. You don't need to know when your birthday is. It's not like anybody was getting a driver's license or all they drank was alcohol because the water wasn't safe. So It's not like anybody was carding anybody. So yeah, this affair begins. And Mary is traditionally beautiful by the English standard of the day. She's got that pale skin that's like creamy in a sort of are you recovering from tuberculosis kind of way, like very pale, blonde or strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes, slim with big boobs. God, it's actually kind of amazing what's changed in 500 years, isn't it? Now listen, it was a different time, and back then, men really enjoyed skinny blondes with big boobs. Okay.
Now, a lot of historians will say that Henry was a serial monogamist. He didn't just have, a different woman in bed every night. It seems he went from long-term affair to long-term affair.
Which I think that must have been worse, right? For Catherine? I think that would be worse.
Yes, I think so too. If you think it's just sex, okay, fine, whatever. But it's really prolonged interest in another person.
Emotional investment,
yeah. And Catherine was still in love with her husband despite him no longer visiting her bed, neither for procreation nor for the recreational purposes. And Mary would have 2 children who are said to be Cary's, but both children, especially her firstborn daughter called Catherine, born in 1524, and her son Henry, born in 1526, are thought by some historians to have very probably been biologically the king's. It's also a topic of debate now and likely was then, which had to have been difficult for Catherine. But Catherine was keeping herself busy. She started programs to provide relief to the poor. She was a patron of the humanities and good friends with Thomas More and Erasmus. In 1523, she commissioned Juan Luis Vives to write The Education of a Christian Woman, promoting women's rights to an education which was dedicated to her. She also was in regular correspondence with her nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She likely took much joy in overseeing her daughter Mary's education, as she was bright and precocious.
Yeah, it's kind of insane, the stuff that the kids do, right? It's like, by the age of 3, they were proficient at the piano and could speak 17 languages, and it's like, what? I guess because they died at 30. Yeah, there was no TV, there was nothing else to do. It's true. So, in 1522, Anne returned to England after spending 7 years at the French court. She was originally summoned back by her father to marry an Irish cousin, but that fell through, and she suddenly found herself a lady-in-waiting to Katherine of Aragon. And her first documented appearance at court is March 1st, 1522. We don't know exactly when the king's affair with Mary ended, presumably sometime around when her second child was born, but the sisters would have been at court at the same time, just moving in different social circles. And Anne was actually much closer to her brother George than she was to her sister. They just had more similar interests and theological views. In early 1523, it seems that Anne fell in love with and secretly betrothed herself to Henry Percy. He was the son of the 5th Earl of Northumberland, but when the Earl found out, he refused to accept this match for his son, and when she appealed to Cardinal Wolsey in January of 1524, he also refused the match, and Anne was sent back to Hever, and she was, I just imagine, just furious.
Yeah, Wolsey was no favorite of Anne's, and I think it's safe to say that the feeling was mutual, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that Anne had become passionate about was reforming the church, and one of her beliefs was that, get ready, this is wild. She really believed that the Mass should be said in English rather than only in Latin. She wanted everybody to be able to understand what was being said. Later on, she would be known as an early Protestant, but at that time, Anne would have never considered herself a Protestant. She was very much a Catholic until the day she died. She believed in transubstantiation and she was a Catholic.
Isn't she also like a kind of a patron saint for Protestants? Something like that, right?
She is, very much so, yeah, because she did start sort of, her presence in his life started the English Reformation, but at that time, she never would have, do you know what I mean? It's one of those things, like now we think she's like the head of the Protestant movement.
In retrospect,
but at that time, she would not have seen herself in that way at all. But yeah, making religion more accessible to the people would have just been a scandal at that time. And Anne seems to have caught the eye of the king around February or March of 1526. Anne was not conventionally pretty. Anne is described as being dark-haired with a small bust and an olive complexion. Most noted were her eyes and her grace, and several sources tell us she wasn't particularly pretty, but she was sexy. She had that thing that just draws people to them, you know, that magnetism that some people have. And she was smart and funny. But she had seen what happened to his last mistress, one of them being her sister, and she didn't want that for herself. She wanted more, and she told the king she would not give up her virginity until she was married.
And sadly, they could never marry because he already had a loving, dutiful and faithful wife who he'd been married to for about 17 years at that point.
Yes, of course, and also that. Yes, ay que lástima. But now we find ourselves in the king's great matter. So the king was a devoutly Catholic man, remember, defender of the faith, all that. He had started to get a little bit of an unhealthy obsession, I would say, on why he didn't have a son. And he had fixated on a couple of passages in Leviticus, And it suddenly dawned on him, of course, this is the reason he didn't have a son. These passages specifically were Leviticus 18:16, quote, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife, it is thy brother's nakedness," end quote. And Leviticus 20:21, which says, quote, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless," end quote. Which this now told Henry clear as day that that's the reason he doesn't have a kid. He should never have married Catherine after his brother died. He conveniently forgot that they had gotten the special dispensation from the Pope and the fact that the marriage wasn't consummated, so therefore null.
Yeah, he also felt that this was why he had no heir. They had been childless.
He had that child, though, his daughter Mary. She was a healthy child, around 10 at this time.
Yes, but girl children don't count.
Right. Yes, of course. So sorry. So this idea got into his head, and he felt sure, confident, this was the reason for his lack of a son. He told Wolsey to look into it and wrote a letter to the Pope explaining his deep concern at having offended God in this way, and expressed wanting to annul his marriage. This was problematic. First, just in writing the letter, he was implying the Pope may have made a mistake in allowing the marriage to Catherine to take place, and that could never happen because the Pope was completely infallible. Secondly, Catherine knew the validity of their marriage was being looked into, but she thought it must be Wolsey's doing. She still believed that Henry loved her. So on June 22nd, 1527, Henry told his wife that he felt they must separate because they had been living in sin, and he'd like her to just go ahead and choose a house to retire to until everything was sorted.
Can you imagine the audacity of your husband telling you this?
How dare you? No, I really can't.
Catherine was not having it. She insisted there was no question that their marriage was valid, and there was absolutely no way she would ever even consider a divorce. Her nephew, so her sister's son, Emperor Charles V, also happened to have the Pope being held prisoner after the sack of Rome a month earlier, so good luck to Henry's envoys. Again, this is an oversimplification to say that this was a really long, drawn-out divorce process.
Yeah, I think this might be the worst divorce in the history of divorces, possibly.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, but Anne knew how to handle Henry. She knew how to play the game and how to leave him wanting more. Unlike Catherine, who deferred to her husband, the king, Anne passionately argued with him about religious reform, politics, literature, art, you name it. Unfortunately, we don't have very many letters from Anne to Henry, but we do have some from Henry, and by we I mean the Vatican. The Vatican has letters from Henry. These letters were probably intercepted at the time by papal spies working on behalf of Catherine. Anne recognized when Henry was really feeling bothered, so she played it hard to get and that kind of thing, but anytime there was a touch where, oh, he seems a bit annoyed with me now, oh, I'm on my way back to court, I miss you so much, and this just kept on.
In German, we call it Zuckerbrot und Peitsche.
One more time.
Zuckerbrot und Peitsche, which means sweet bread and whip. You're always changing your tone, and one time you're feeding them sweet stuff, and the next time you're whipping them.
Yes, I think that's very much what the relationship was like here. So in 1528, there was another terrible outbreak of sweating sickness, and so Henry and Catherine both left London. Anne left court for Hever Castle. Unfortunately, she still caught it, and she became very ill. So did her sister Mary's husband, William Carey. Henry sent his second favorite physician to her because he cared enough to send the second best. And thankfully, Anne recovered. But her brother-in-law did not, leaving her sister a widow with 2 children. In 1529, realizing the king was getting impatient with him to convince Pope Clement to provide the annulment from Catherine, and he was falling out of favor, Cardinal Wolsey gifted Hampton Court Palace to him. Now, see, I've heard this a few different ways. I've heard it in one way where he was stripped of his titles because it was taking too long to get this annulment that he wanted. You know what I mean? And so Anne was like, take all his stuff. And Henry was like, great idea. This is mine now. But then I also heard that he built Hampton Court, Wolsey built Hampton Court, and the king was like, wow, this place is nicer than anything I've got. And he was immediately like, it's yours.
I mean, what else can he say? That's how it worked back then.
Yeah.
You can't outshine the king. It's just not possible.
No. And if you have strong feelings about head retention, you just give them the house. Just take the house. It's yours now. So glad you like it. Please take my palatial mansion.
And in the meanwhile, Catherine has refused to just go off to a grand house with the title Dowager Princess of Wales, the title she'd have as Arthur's widow. She would not dedicate herself to God and join a nunnery because she was already married in the eyes of God, and their daughter was not going to be made a bastard just so her husband could marry his goggle-eyed whore. So I'm sorry, but that's the term her supporters used for Anne. It's not what I would call her.
No. So on June 21st, 1529, Catherine made the following speech at the papal divorce hearings, and she said, quote, "Sir, I beseech you, for all the love that hath been between us, let me have justice and right. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman and a stranger, born out of your dominion. I have here no friend, and much less indifferent counsel. I flee to you as to the head of justice within this realm. I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever comfortable to your will and pleasure, being always well pleased and contented with all things wherein you had any delight or dalliance. I loved all those whom ye loved only for your sake, whether I had cause or no, and whether they were my friends or enemies. This 20 years or more I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had divers children, although it hath pleased God to call them from this world, which hath been no default in me. And when ye had me at first, I take God to my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man. And whether this be true or no, I put it to your conscience. Therefore, I humbly require you to spare me the extremity of this new court, and if ye will not, to God I commit my cause." End quote.
And ultimately, Catherine was sent to increasingly uncomfortable castles and estates, and most cruelly, worried they might collude against him, he separated Catherine from their daughter, Mary.
That's awful. It's just unnecessarily cruel. You know, when they didn't get their way, they just got mean. And I think it's fair to say also that Henry was kind of a ghoster, wasn't he? He didn't end relationships properly. He had his people handle things while he just moved on to the next women.
Well, he couldn't be bothered with, thinking about his ex if he was already head over heels.
That's true, I guess.
For someone who ran into the field of battle or into a jousting match, he was a really big coward when it came to ending relationships.
He really was. And it's like behavior you expect from it's something I did and deeply regret when I was still a teenager. But you're a teenager whose brain is still developing. You're not an adult responsible for, a realm.
Yeah, but I mean, as a king, you're used to getting your way and that others take care of the things you don't want to take care of.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. But yeah, he would just leave other people to do with it. It's unpleasant. Someone else will do it. And again, we cannot emphasize enough what an oversimplification this is. But once Henry realized that the Pope was not going to grant him the annulment he so desperately needed, Wolsey was out. He died at the end of 1530 of an illness before he was able to be tried, and he probably would have been convicted for treason.
Yeah.
Now Cromwell was in, and Henry and his advisors began to retaliate by closing nunneries and monasteries and seizing the wealth that was found there, which started the process of a break from the Church of Rome, the Catholic Church. In the fall of 1532, Henry and Anne, who had been given the title Marquess of Pembroke, married in secret and consummated the marriage. They were formally married on January 25th, 1533. Anne was now pregnant and certain she was carrying his son. Henry was no doubt deeply gratified when on the 23rd of May, 1533, Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry and Catherine's marriage null and void, and 5 days later he declared Henry and Anne's marriage to be valid. Anne was crowned Queen of England on the 1st of June, 1533, visibly pregnant, in a lavish ceremony at Westminster. Of course, as soon as Pope Clement heard this, he excommunicated the king and Cranmer. Once excommunicated, Henry became the head of the Church of England, a title that's still held by today's monarch, Elizabeth II. The English Reformation has now begun, but you can't have Elizabeth II without having had the first Queen Elizabeth, and she was born a little bit prematurely on September 7th to mother Queen Anne and father Henry VIII. The astrologers and doctors, who all insisted he was having a boy, were wrong. The baby was a girl. And Henry, while gazing into the eyes of this daughter, who wasn't the son he had wanted, had no idea this girl would one day be regarded as England's maybe most well-known and most well-loved monarchs. Elizabeth's older sister, half-sister, Mary, was stripped of the title princess and was now known as the Lady Mary. Catherine again refused to accept that her marriage to Henry had ended, and Mary, who had already been separated from her mother, was sent to join the household of the Princess Elizabeth at Hatfield in Hertfordshire. Her servants were dismissed, and Mary at this time would have been 17, so probably super thrilled. And it does seem that Anne and Henry were often unnecessarily cruel to Mary, I would say. She had a lot to endure. It does seem, though, like all the siblings did have, at varying times, I guess as siblings do, genuine affection for each other. It's just like the next time someone's like, ugh, my family is so complicated and angsty, don't worry about it. The Tudors were worse. So much worse. Anne was a very flamboyant queen. She was fashionable and a patron of the arts. She and her ladies-in-waiting, and I should mention that she had over 200 women attending her. They would sew clothes for the poor. She made monetary donations to her struggling subjects, even though many of them hated her and still considered Catherine their queen.
I think that's probably why she was so determined to do things for the poor and for...
I think so too, yeah. Yeah, and there are some accounts where it's like she was afraid of big, huge mobs of women. Women especially were very angry, which you understand. Like, we all understand it. The women as a whole in the world, we all do a collective eye roll every time, somebody ends his marriage of 40 years to run off with the 18-year-old secretary or whatever. But I think it's fair also to say that just as Catherine was not like just this crazy religious zealot whose faith led to her downfall and stubbornness, really, I think I would also say Anne was not this like conniving witch who stole Henry from Catherine. Yeah. She was pretty remarkable in that time to have realized that when the king set his eye on her, she had to be very careful, or she'd end up like her sister, the former mistress, who was so poor after her husband died, she had to beg her father and sister for help, and Anne did it. She became queen. She did find, however, that providing an heir was not going to be as easy as she had assumed. I'm not sure why we don't have the same sort of records as we did with Catherine in terms of how many pregnancies and losses there were, but it seems like most sources agree there were 3 pregnancies and 1 living child. After Elizabeth, there seems to have been a miscarriage in 1534. And then Catherine died at Kimbolton Castle on the 7th of January, 1536. Fortunately, even though she was supposed to be, for the most part, completely alone, her dearest friend Maria de Salinas had disobeyed orders and gone to be with Catherine in the end. She may have been the one to write the last letter from Catherine to Henry, and it reads as follows. My most dear Lord King and husband, the hour of my death now drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me, my case being such, to commend myself to you, and to put you in remembrance with a few words of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care and pampering of your body, for the which you have cast me into many calamities, and yourself into many troubles. For my part, I pardon you everything, and I wish to devoutly pray God that he will pardon you also. For the rest, I commend unto you our daughter Mary, beseeching you to be a good father unto her, as I have heretofore desired. I entreat you also, on behalf of my maids, to give them marriage portions, which is not much, they being but 3. For all my other servants, I solicit the wages due them, and a year more, lest they be unprovided for. Lastly, I make this vow that mine eyes desire you above all things. Catherine the Queen.
And she died aged 50 in exile at Kimbolton Castle, never having seen her daughter again either. And people at the time suspected she may have been poisoned, but an autopsy found a black mass around her heart, which today would be cancer.
The following day, news of her death reached the king, and he and Anne appeared dressed in yellow. And there were one of 2 reasons of this. Either he was paying respects to her by wearing a traditional color of mourning, or Anne was pregnant again and they were celebrating the death of that which had caused them so much red tape and wasted time. Then, on the 29th of January, 1536, Henry was seriously injured in a joust, and Anne believed it was the shock and worry for his life that caused her to miscarry a boy at about 4 months. This was the same day as Catherine's funeral. Her tomb is in Peterborough Cathedral and is often decorated by visitors who leave her pomegranates, her personal emblem, and flowers. Her tomb originally just said Catherine, and it wasn't until a while after her death that Queen of England was added. Meanwhile, Anne is growing more and more concerned. There had been other affairs, and I did read one source that said that when Anne and the women that she knew Henry was sleeping with would cross paths, there were a lot of, cat fights. I think there were actual, slapping, scratching. I don't know how valid that is, but I could see it sort of.
Yeah.
But Anne was now aware that the king was growing closer to one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, which should come as no surprise because she herself was in Catherine's court, right? I never understand people who get together with someone who's already in a relationship and then they're really surprised when they get cheated on by the person that cheated on the last person with you.
Because they always think it's just them.
Yeah.
He just cheated with me because I'm his...
Because we're soulmates.
One and only.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're soulmates.
That's almost
or
never
he
the
changed
case.
Because of me or whatever. Yeah. Always the same. And I think these things happen sometimes, but I wouldn't count on it.
No, I know. So, all right, let's discuss this sexy doormat, aka Jane Seymour.
So Jane was possibly born at Wolfhall sometime between 1504 and 1509, and she was a fifth cousin to the king. She had not been as highly educated as Catherine or Anne. She could read and write a bit, but was much more skilled at household management and seems to have been quite the artist. So her needlework was apparently stunning and intricate, and today she'd be called an artist. It seems that she even taught Henry needlework, who enjoyed it as a pastime. We know she was maid of honor to Catherine in 1532, if not earlier, and she went on to serve Queen Anne, as did her sister Elizabeth. It seems the first serious report of the king being interested in Jane were in February of 1536.
And this was probably while Anne was still recovering from that last miscarriage. So now not only is Anne suffering the physical and emotional effects of losing yet another child, this most recent son, but her enemies were growing, and the allegations were growing too, from conspiracy to adultery to witchcraft, and ultimately even incest. Oh yeah, her enemies were definitely growing by the day, and soon there was talk there might be a second annulment needed, a second divorce. But there wasn't going to be an annulment or a divorce for Anne. There's no way they'd have gone through, and by they I mean Henry and his advisors, would have gone through that long, drawn-out process again. Jane was being moved into royal apartments, and Anne's brother was snubbed by the king, and things were happening really very quickly. And at the end of April, beginning of May, 5 men, including Anne's own brother George, were arrested on charges of having sexual relationships with the Queen, which was treason. The evidence against them was ridiculous, and yet some of them did confess to adultery under torture. But you remember our episode on the medieval torture methods. This era now, we're sort of moving out of medieval into Renaissance. So I think some of those tools might have been used on these men, none of whom I don't think were actually guilty of having sexual relations with the Queen, but they were convicted and executed at the Tower on the 17th of May, 1536. When Anne was initially brought to the Tower, her fears were abated somewhat when she was set up in the same royal apartments that they had used before her coronation. Her behavior was sort of unsurprisingly changeable from calm to very hysterical, like she'd burst out into hysterical laughter, and then weeping again. Sadly, Anne was tried, and she did admit that she was not always as deferential as she should be to her husband, and that her temper could be a problem, but she swore that she had never been unfaithful. She was convicted and would be executed on Tower Green by burning or beheading. That was up for the king to decide. She would be the first English queen executed, and Henry had a special executioner brought in from France to use a sword in one strike to kill her.
From Calais.
Was it from Calais?
Mm-hmm. He was very good at his job, apparently.
very good at his job. And some historians still debate if this was he trying to show her mercy? Did he just want to make sure it happened quick and without incident to just move on again? Was it a nod back to chivalry and like his position as king? I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to put our heads around today, I guess, to be in this kind of situation and how difficult it was, and with Anne knowing her brother had been beheaded. Fortunately, she didn't know the king was already planning on marrying Jane Seymour. The following is from my favorite book about this topic, one of my favorites, which is Allison Weir's book, The Six Wives of Henry VIII. So this is again, she says there's a crowd of a few thousand, and, quote, a great murmur arose from the crowd as Anne Boleyn advanced on her short walk to Tower Green. She wore a robe of dark gray or black damask, trimmed with fur, with a low square neck and a crimson kirtle. From her shoulders flowed a long white cape. She looked exhausted and dazed, which was partly the result of 2 sleepless nights and partly from apprehension. She also kept looking behind her as if she expected at any moment to see the king's messenger come galloping into the tower to bring word of a reprieve. If so, it was a vain hope. On the scaffold, the headsman, black-garbed and hooded, his sword hidden in the straw, waited with his assistant and a priest beside the low wooden block. Anne mounted the steps with great composure and smiled as she gazed down on the people below her. She asked Kingston not to give the signal for her death until she had spoken, quote, that which she had a mind to say, end quote. Then, with an untroubled countenance and a firm voice, she delivered a carefully prepared speech. Quote, good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly to the will of the king, my lord. And if in my life I did ever offend the king's grace, surely with my death I do now atone. I come hither to accuse no man, nor speak anything of that whereof I am accused, as I know full well that aught I say in my defense doth not appertain to you. I pray and beseech you all, good friends, to pray for the life of the king, my sovereign lord and yours, who was one of the best princes on the face of the earth, who has always treated me so well that better could not be, wherefore I submit to death with good will, humbly asking pardon of all the world. If any person will meddle with my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. End quote. She then turned to her ladies who had ascended the scaffold with her and told them not to be sorry to see her die, begging their pardon for any harshness towards them, praying them to take comfort for her loss, and admonishing them to, quote, be faithful to her whom with happier fortune ye may have as your queen and mistress, end quote. Anne then gave her prayer book to Lady Lee, entitled The Hours of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It had been made and illuminated for Anne in France around 1528, and she had inscribed in it, quote, remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. End quote. The prayer book still survives and is now at Hever Castle. Her farewell speech is done, Anne knelt with the priest for some final prayers. Then she rose and took off her French hood, beneath which she had on a coif over her long dark hair, bound high so as not to impede the headsman, who now knelt to ask her forgiveness for what he must do. This she granted and gave him his fee. Then she unclasped her necklace and knelt before the block. One of her maids tied a blindfold around her eyes, then withdrew to join the other ladies, who were weeping in a corner of the scaffold. The crowd also knelt out of respect for the passing of a soul. Then, as Anne prayed aloud, saying over and over again, quote, Jesu, receive my soul, O Lord God, have pity on my soul. To Christ I commend my soul, quote, the executioner retrieved his sword and cut off her head before you could say a paternoster, according to Sir John Spellman, who was present. Then the headsman picked up the head and held it aloft, crying in heavily accented English, quote, so perish all the king's enemies, end quote. At this moment, the onlookers saw the dead woman's eyes and lips move, a reflex action resulting from the shock of decapitation to the nervous system, yet to Tudor eyes an almost supernatural phenomenon. The Queen died boldly, Kingston wrote to Cromwell later, quote, "God take her into his mercy," end quote. Quickly the crowd dispersed, and soon Tower Green was deserted, save for the broken body on the scaffold and the 4 weeping ladies who kept vigil beside it. No coffin had been provided, but an arrow chest lay waiting beside the steps. Reverently, the ladies lifted the pathetic remains into it and covered them with the sheet. The chest was then carried into the royal chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where it was buried in the choir that afternoon. End quote. I've got pictures of that to share too. When Anne's head hit the straw, the guns on the Tower Wharf were fired, and Henry would have heard them over the sound of craftsmen removing the initials A to replace it with a J.
So Henry had now had Catherine's death release him from that marriage, and his hastening of Anne's had made him free to marry again, and he'd had that marriage annulled as well. He was ready to father an heir, and he would become betrothed to Jane the day after Anne's execution, and they were married on 30th of May 1536. She was publicly named queen on 4th of June. The plague was an issue in London, so she never had a formal coronation. Catherine was a queen in her own right, Henry's equal. Anne was a tempest that started off as a passionate love, but cooled fast when she challenged him and did not give him a son. But Jane was quiet, obedient, soothing, maternal. Jane brought peace back to the relationship between Henry and his daughter Mary, in part because of her religious beliefs, although Henry did warn her to keep her thoughts to herself and remember what happened to Anne. Anne had been flashy and fun at court, and that got her an adultery brand and the loss of her head. Jane's court was formal and conservative. By Christmas of the same year, Jane was pregnant and had sadly miscarried. She was pregnant again quickly in January of 1537, and she led a quiet life. Henry sourced food to appease her cravings.
Yeah, of course he did. Pregnant queen wants quail. Pregnant queen gets quail. I mean, is it too much to ask for some quail?
I think that's very appropriate.
It's fair.
Honestly.
It's fair.
I mean,
she didn't want
that's
Twizzlers.
the least he could do.
Yeah.
She was surrounded by the best midwives and physicians of the time. She went into confinement in September, and on 12th of October 1537 at 2 a.m. she gave birth to a boy. Edward, christened a few days later, both of his sisters holding the train of the christening gown. The king and queen were overjoyed, but Jane soon became terribly sick and would die on the 24th of October. She was laid to rest on 12th of November 1537 at Windsor Castle. There was a procession of 29 mourners, one for each year of her life, were led by her stepdaughter Mary, who was chief mourner. She would be the only one of Henry VI's wife to receive a proper queen's funeral. Henry wore black for the next 3 months.
But don't worry, Henry wasn't the sort of man to stay single for long, and we'll be back next week with the second half of this story. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's exciting. I want to just once more suggest that you check out our sources, please, because we have left out so much interesting stuff, like Henry demanding Catherine return her jewels so he could give them to Anne. Can you imagine? The Field of the Cloth of Gold, which was like a huge meeting between France and England. So much money wasted. Just major religious strife and Reformation. Hopefully we've given you enough of a taste to read on and I don't know. If you find them as interesting as we do, you'll find ways to find out more about them in our sources. What's your something good this week?
My something good for this week is the TV show The Tudors. Of course, it's not entirely accurate, but it's very sexy, great-looking people being very sexy and good-looking with each other in 16th century England. So I highly recommend to watch it. And it has Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, and he's gorgeous.
He is.
Henry Cavill is also in there.
Yes.
So good looking.
Yeah, and I love Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, but I think, I can't remember his name. His first name is Sam, the guy that plays Jamie on Outlander. He would have been well cast, I think, as Henry. I always had a hard time with a dark-haired Henry VIII.
Yeah.
But again, I agree. It's super fun. I haven't watched it since it first came out, and so I should go back and do a rewatch. There's also the new one about Catherine I keep meaning to watch. I don't know if you have that over there, The Spanish Princess.
I haven't watched it yet.
I think it's on Stars, but we haven't watched it yet. I also want to recommend that book by Allison Weir. She's great. She writes historical fiction too. Yeah. What else?
Thank you for listening. If you want to know about our Patreon, go over to patreon.com and search for Fresh Hell. We should pop right up. Or you go to our webpage www.freshhellpodcast.com, and there you find the link to Patreon, to Facebook, to our merch store. You find a link to our PO box and how to contact us. As for Patreon, We are a little bit late this month with our episode. We had some technical difficulties last week when we wanted to record, but we're going to drop the next episode in a couple of days, right?
Yeah, don't worry, Patreon people. We haven't forgotten you. We have things planned still. We'll get there, we promise.
If you don't want to join Patreon, go and check out our Facebook group.
Yeah, such a nice group of people in the Facebook group, honestly. It's great. It's just a really nice, supportive group of people.
It's so fun. I think it's so fun on Facebook when people ask questions that have nothing to do with our podcast or with true crime, and they get a lot of answers and everybody is eager to help out, right?
Yes, I go there now.
I love it.
Yeah, I need help finding a new lamp, so I'm going to be asking for help there. Yeah, it's good people, good stuff. Yeah, if you have a moment, please leave us a review, and we would really appreciate that. It helps other people find us. You can also tell friends about us if you think they might enjoy this sort of content.
Please tell your pets that we love them. Tell them we said hi, hug them, be kind to them,
yes.
Cuddle them. I think it's also very cold in the US right now, right?
It is very cold, yes. Yes, cold and icy.
So put another dog in the bed.
Yeah.
It's how many dogs a night?
Oh, at least 4. We need a bigger bed. Oh, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And we will be back next week with the rest of this story. And until then, if you are going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye-bye.